Before we get to today's guest, I just want to let you all know that CityWorks Expo 2017 is coming up October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. We're really excited about the group of speakers we put together for this year, and we've got a number of exciting activities and additional resources we're looking forward to bringing to the table as well. So I hope you'll take a look at our website, cityworksexpo.com, or check us out on Facebook. And just take a look, maybe get yourself a ticket. We'd love to have you guys down to Roanoke. Or check out the fellowship program, which includes a free ticket, but also has access to a number of resources and mentorship opportunities that we're putting together. So thank you all for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoy it today. And please do give us a rating and review in iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. And reach out if you have any questions. Hope to see you come October. But in the meantime, have a great day.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Mr. Mike Lydon, a principal with Street Plans Collaborative and one of the founders of Tactical Urbanism. And I have to say, one of my own personal heroes in this world. So thank you so much for taking the time today, Mike.
You're welcome. That's very kind. Happy to be here.
Well, yes. Now you live up in the big bad city of New York, right? So.
I do.
Now, how did you kind of get into this world of urban planning and creating better communities?
Well, I grew up in a very small town in Maine, and so it's kind of funny when people hear this story, because I now live in Brooklyn, and we've got about 2.6 million people in the borough alone, and there's about 1.3 million people in Maine. My town actually had this incredible fabric of 3 or 4 blocks of mixed-use walkable streets on the main street, and I always, as a little kid, loved going to town and being in that environment. And then that kind of was only amplified when I would go and spend time with my family down in Boston. And so I kind of got more and more interested in cities and the way they worked. And to me, it felt like the 3 blocks on my main street growing up were basically replicated, 100,000 times over in a larger city. So I really loved that environment and started to learn more and more about how cities were planned and managed, and academically got interested in planning, probably like a lot of people, following the introduction to Sim City as a computer game. And so it was from that point forward, I loved, this idea of being in control of all these different elements that comprise everyone's daily life in a town or a city of any size. But it's really only through school and eventually getting a master's degree in planning that I started to realize that city planning was not exactly about being the almighty powerful person controlling the tax rates and where you build roads and what density goes where. And, in fact, it was frustrating to learn that, you could make a pretty plan or a great drawing or what have you. And in fact, that means very, very little on the actual impact to the city. And then what will get built ultimately, it's much more of a social, political process that coming out of graduate school was a good wake-up call for me in realizing that.
Now, it's interesting to hear that you had that very typical, in some ways, urban planning background, and then you've come out and you've kind of, I think it started by documenting some of what you're seeing, but also building some new stuff. So kind of, you guys are one of the leads on this idea of tactical urbanism. And so how do you kind of describe what that is, and how does it differ from that kind of world and training that you grew up with?
Yeah, so when I left graduate school, I got to work at a very well-known and accomplished urban design firm, and that was extremely exciting for me. And so I picked up from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and moved down to Miami, and was involved with a number of projects locally. And they were impactful. They were very large scale, very progressive in their thinking. But I started to realize that the speed at which progress could be realized was much, much slower than I had wanted, or a lot of people had wanted, in terms of thinking about how the city could become more livable. And so it was from that experience that I started to kind of poke around a little bit, and at the same time was doing a lot of bicycle advocacy work on the side in Miami, and experiencing the frustrations of trying to bike around that town, which in 2008, which was kind of the middle of my time there, was ranked by Bicycling Magazine as one of the top 3 worst cities in America in which to cycle, and they were 100% accurate. So there's kind of this coalescing of being a little bit frustrated professionally in the rate of change, as exciting as the projects were that I was engaged with, but also coming from an advocacy standpoint and wanting to inject new thinking into a city that was not thinking in the way of safer streets for walking and cycling necessarily in their planning processes. So we organized with the mayor's office something called Open Streets, patterned after what was happening or does happen in Bogota, Colombia. So we closed down about 2 miles of streets in the core of the city, and thousands of people came out and were walking, biking, sitting in the street, socializing. It was a completely transformative moment for myself personally, but also I think for many others in the city to realize that, hey, we can get around town by walking or cycling, and hey, this is enjoyable. And businesses did well, and the mayor did very well politically based on the event. And so that event got replicated. And in my mind, I started looking around and thinking, well, if Open Streets can be so successful and it's a one-day, relatively low-cost initiative, what else is out there that could push the conversation forward? And what I started to realize was that it was far less important to have formal planning charrettes and workshops and public meetings, and those are important, right? We need to have those kinds of events, but they really can't replace the experiential element of creating opportunities for people to engage in change in their own neighborhoods. And so, that experience coupled with reading one day about the first Better Block event in Dallas, which Jason Robertson, his colleagues had led, and then what was happening in New York City in 2008 and 9, where they were taking large swaths of streets in the middle of the city over with paint and pot plants and very temporary materials, and creating public spaces and bikeways and places for people to gather. Basically, it seemed like out of thin air. It was just this stuff was happening overnight. So I started to kind of connect the dots and see there's a city-led approach to this that could be very participatory, bring change very inexpensively, and try things out. And then there was a very large opportunity for advocates and community groups, such as in Dallas, to take the lead or engage in this work and then push the city to think differently and change regulations and change processes and allow for more of the experiential and tactical side of things to flourish. And that's how I got kind of into this and started documenting these case studies with a few colleagues from around the country and around the world.
That's interesting. There's a ton to kind of pick through there. I do wonder, just to go back to something you said early on in there, that you mentioned how important livability was in some ways. Is that kind of the thing that you think we should be striving for as communities these days? Is how do we as planners or how do we as advocates for communities create livable places?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that's a pretty broad term. And so I should be a little more specific with what I think that means. And what it meant to be a livable city, I believe, a decade ago is not what it means today. I've been just not surprised. I've been, fascinated and scared by the rate of change in some cities, to the degree that, 10 years ago, cities were still desperate for investment in their core, to add housing, to create better transportation amenities and public space amenities. And this was really new thinking that, hey, the city could be more attractive if we built this kind of infrastructure, and that cities need to build this kind of infrastructure to produce a high quality of life. And largely in the American city, this kind of infrastructure is missing. And how quickly it's gone from the need to build that in to then the concern being we've built a lot of these things in a lot of cities and communities now, and the demand has outpaced the supply of the opportunity for people to live, work, and engage in communities in these places, or it's pushed people who've been there all along out to the fringes or even outside of the city. So what livability means now, I think, is not what it meant then. And now I think it's a lot more about the equity of opportunity and housing, and be able to have access to all of the economic opportunities in the form of jobs and mobility in terms of being able to get around without a high burden of cost with depending on automobiles. So having robust and affordable transportation is so important. And the challenge is all these amenities conflict in the sense that they produce a lot of value and desirability. So that's kind of where we are now. Not in every city, but certainly in a number of cities around the country and around the world that have really been on a fast pace in terms of development and growth and lots of demand to live in these kinds of high quality places, but maybe not enough supply or definitely not enough thinking about how we make sure those opportunities get spread throughout. And it's in any one city, it's a microcosm of issues that we have, facing us around the whole country.
It's just such a fascinating explanation of how the questions are changing so rapidly. How is that part of what you think this idea of tactical urbanism is good about, is being able to adjust quickly and being able to answer different questions as opposed to taking a 20-year approach and saying these questions we have now are going to be the same questions we have in 20 years?
Yeah, I think it's critical for that very purpose. And that was one of the reasons why I was inspired by others and try to integrate all this into our practice at Street Plans was, how do we get to an understanding or a result or an opportunity faster that can keep up with the rate of change, which the typical planning process can't do. I mean, a planning process can be great for pulling some people together, having coherent, rational thought about the future and about possibilities. But, in a 10-year or longer time frame, that can make some sense. But as soon as you get that plan done, things have changed. And that's the reality on the ground. And so what we're engaged in a lot with cities is, how do you build a bridge between the two, or provide a methodology of planning and iteration that, through the practicing of ideas and through the trialing of concepts and through the engagement that naturally comes with putting things out onto the street, out into the public realm, how you learn to create a different vision for the longer term than what you might have initially thought or from the beginning of the process. So to be more clear, let's take a specific street. If you have a main street in your downtown, and let's say you want to, revitalize that street, or, come up with a different scheme on the street, you might go into that thinking, well, I have an idea and I have a vision right off the bat, and the community might have a vision for that street. But as soon as you start trying things out and changing things and tinkering with the street in real time, that vision almost always will change, because you will learn so much from talking to businesses, from users of the street, people walking, biking, driving, making deliveries. All of these little things you just can't get in the bubble of planning surface really, really quickly, that inform the design and the thinking and the management of what that street should actually and can become in the longer term. So it helps us get to be more accurate in our thinking and our plans, and more representative in our thinking and our plans in a lot faster time frame than the typical planning process.
It's interesting to me, this question of has come up in several conversations I've had recently, but this idea of needing to do better engagement, I think, is something that we at CityWorks believe in wholeheartedly. But there's also this question of balancing that with people that have a certain expertise and know certain things that work in certain situations. And so, there's an example of someone started a local farm here in Roanoke. They wanted to start a store, and so they were asking their community members, what do you want in a store? And it was they wanted a lot of sodas and a lot of things like that. And he's like, well, that's not the point. So you wind up with this conflict between those that have this certain expertise and what the community says that they want or thinks that they want and or does want. And how do you kind of marry those two and make sure that you can work together?
Yeah, that's a hard thing. And we face this all the time. Whether maybe it's not necessarily soda, but it's usually, some elements that we think, or in fact, we even know from lots of research and data and results on the ground, creates a healthier, more accessible place. People don't always see it that way because it's not what they're used to, or it's not something they've experienced before. And so they tend to have their own desires and ways of thinking, and that's really important. But what tactical urbanism allows us to do is kind of widen that field of view for a lot of people to think, you know what, this isn't so bad having this option. You know, it's not so bad to be able to do this. And I actually see that I enjoy this, my family enjoys this, or this could be good for my business. And the temporary nature of these projects makes that a lot less threatening, so that people access these ideas without the threat of permanence from the get-go. So we can have, some broader and more important conversations. And in this way, through these kinds of projects and this approach, you're able to really educate and underscore the opportunities for people who are taking part, right? So, perhaps somebody who, let's take the soda example, perhaps someone doesn't know that soda has as much sugar in it that it does. Well, guess what? Doing some sort of a program or event that draws people out to a conversation that might have something to do with physical activity can also have a lot of information available readily for people to understand, visualize, why soda is unhealthy. If you show them the amount of sugar stacked up in a cup, not just the liquid form, but the actual sugar, it is that kind of approach where you understand, oh, I understand that now at scale. This is probably not a good thing. Or I should think about cutting that back. Or maybe I want soda, but I also want to have healthier access to other things as well, if you get my drift.
Absolutely. Well, it's, I think that one of the things that we struggle with throughout all of this is that who is determining success is a big question with a lot of this stuff. And it's hard. I think, there are those people that think bike lanes are the most important thing, and there are those people that think urban farms are the most important thing, but then there are those that also think that if you do a short-term project, that's never going to be a huge success, that you have to do something big and think on a big scale. So how do you who should be the one, do you think, to determine success in these situations?
Well, I think we all need to determine what is success, and I think one of the things we don't do well as communities is having broad conversations about the kinds of places that we want to live in. And it usually gets down to a specific plan or goes so general and uses a process where people don't engage, because if it's wishy-washy about the future and, I just need to get home and cook dinner for my kids tonight, there's no way I'm going to go to a library at 7:30 on a Tuesday night, to participate. So that's one of the problems in terms of the way we engage and how we talk about the future and people's roles in cities. So we also don't really take the idea that planning can be a really impactful way to educate people about towns and cities and town making from the earliest of ages. There's a history of school-age children in this country a long time ago and other countries currently where they get access to information to think about the importance of how we collectively participate, engage, and build our communities has direct outcomes back on our quality of lives, on our relationships, and on the health of our bodies and our families and our friends. That link is not usually drawn very clearly through most planning processes or through the education system. So there's a big gap there that I see that's missing. And there's this example of the Wacker Manual, for example, from the 1900s. In 1914, I believe it was released, and it was a manual for 8th grade students in Chicago, which explained the Daniel Burnham Plan of 1909 and the importance of that vision and the role that students and citizens have to play in their communities. It was very strongly embedded into that 135-page book. I can't believe that we've not replicated that idea in some sense, whether it's a graphic comic or graphic novel or some other readily accessible form. I would love to see more of that happening, so that the thinking behind the future and the excitement and the opportunity that's there gets placed right into the hands of our youngest citizens in school, so they realize that they can be part of something that's bigger than themselves.
Do you think that we all perhaps have a problem understanding how all of these things play in together? I mean, I think that there are, to go back to that example of defining success, that there are a lot of people that don't see anything other than having a bike lane on the ground and what that does. But really the ripple effects out of there. So, I mean, I wonder what we could do perhaps to expand the knowledge that all of these things work together, because it's, I think you'd agree. That's where the transformative effect comes in many ways. That's how these short-term events can become such a big deal, right?
Yeah, and it's very difficult because we have like many other industries, planning and city building has become about specialization, and I could certainly be guilty of it too. It's very hard not to be focused on the things that you have the most competency in. And as a field, whether you're an engineer, you're a landscape architect, you're a designer, planner, architect, advocate, everyone has their specialty in their role, but there's very few people who look out for how those things all come together. And this is one of the reasons why I think a strong mayor, city manager, or city councilors, if they're not educated in how all these things come together and need to be put together to work comprehensively and not just be a collection of individual silos and their outcomes, then we're in trouble. And I can think of a handful of cities where you have a mayor who does understand that and staffs his or her departments and teams to think holistically and be generalists first, and then think about the things on the specialties that can come in and serve the more general opportunity and visions and goals of a community. And we need a lot more of that, I believe, in our towns and in our cities to be successful. And to get there, I think is quite challenging.
Well, yeah, we're going through a process right now in Roanoke where our city manager has moved on, and we're seeking a new leader in that way. And it's a scary process in many ways because you don't know. We're not in charge of it in some ways as the community, and so we don't know who we're going to get, and it's hard to live on from success, I think, in some ways. So, well, I want to ask, coming from part of my background in the nonprofit world, there's often an idea that something that's not permanent is of less value than something that's a permanent or establishment. This is obviously something that you guys have shown not to be so true, but can you explain a little bit of why that's not the case and why we should think differently about these things?
Yeah, where we see the short-term action creating long-term change is the actors who are involved see the need for the long-term change from the very beginning. This isn't a movement or an idea about just going out into the street and doing something that's fun for the day. That's good. That's important. Doing a block party or painting your street or having a fair. Those are all good things for your community, I believe. But what makes tactical urbanism a little bit different is its orientation towards the future and really thinking about a vision and then trying it in the short term. And if you as an organization, if you as a city don't have the kinds of tools and approach in place where you can explicitly draw what you learn from the short-term test and connect it to the middle or long-term policy or infrastructure investment, then what you're doing in the short term is likely not going to be as impactful as you wish. Now, that's not always the case. There are projects that do come out of the woodwork, so to speak, in communities where there was no plan for it, there was no long-term vision, and somebody made such a bold move and such an impact using something that's short-term and temporary that it then very quickly transitions into a permanent policy or into longer-term investment from a municipality or a state government or what have you. That can happen, but what we're trying to do is what we've learned from is how you do these projects in the short term with the short-term low-cost materials and very much have a pathway for long-term investment. And then you're just creating a pathway that makes sure that your long-term investments are done more intelligently with broader support politically and socially to make that change. So that's really where the difference is. And a lot of our work in the last couple of years has been transitioning a little bit less away from the, hey, here's this really great change we can make for one day or a week in duration. And, we'll take all the positive energy and all the input and all the data that we can collect in that short time frame and give it over to the city and say, here it is. Good luck. We hope you make a long-term change. Instead, we're looking a lot more at, yes, doing those projects, but making sure we connect it to a policy and a program and a way for a city or an organization to take that work and really build on it in an intelligent way so that if street plans were to leave town tomorrow, there's a sustainable way for other organizations and other advocates in neighborhoods and businesses and city leaders to do the same thing that we've been able to figure out how to do with the design, with the materials work, all that kind of stuff, and be able to replicate it so that stuff can be scalable from short-term to long-term, from small in location to network-based or transformative in nature over time. And we've been practicing long enough now that we've actually started to see that happen, where the very short term has absolutely transitioned into longer-term thinking, policies, programs, and investments that are having a systematic impact. And that's the whole point. That was the whole idea from the beginning, and it's encouraging to see after a few years it's starting to take hold.
Can you give us an example of how that kind of plays out? Like when you're planning a project, so you're planning, something fun and exciting to happen on one day, what kind of stuff will you do to make sure that you're also doing something that'll have a long-term impact out of that?
In the least, we want to, in the planning of a project, communicate to a city through the results that, here's what we did. Here's why this was difficult for us to do, because you didn't have any way to technically say yes to this kind of approach. This isn't a block party, and it's not a half marathon. This is a very specific kind of public space intervention that has a different kind of intent in those kinds of programs. If you don't have a way to make this easy, not just for us as professionals, but for other people in your community who may not be trained professionals, here's what we would change that would have made it easier on us from the beginning. Like there's a takeaway. And then there's a takeaway of, here's how the design worked on the ground. Okay, what design or policy or program barriers do you currently have in place that would prevent this kind of a design from becoming permanent? And whether that's land use and zoning or urban design controls, or that's street design and engineering and public works standards, we want to basically mirror back to the clients, again, whether they're cities or organizations, that there are changes that could be made based on the results of these projects that would make it a lot easier to get the results that you see during that demonstration or that pilot that you say you want to achieve, but you have no means for this to be achieved easily through your regulatory environment.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Do you guys think about this? And as I'm listening to you, this question is coming into my mind, so I have to imagine it's coming into yours as well. That there's a lot of your stuff has been on public space or transportation issues, and a lot of social capital stuff. But I wonder, have you guys been trying to figure out how to apply some of this same theoretical stuff to some of the stuff that's a little less tangible and more or less physical, like job training or segregation, or some of these issues that we know cities face, but that aren't necessarily as design focused, I suppose?
Yeah, a little bit. We've been getting into that a little bit more. We were able to, through a design competition, work with the organization called Happy City, which is based out of Vancouver, Canada. And you might know the book Happy City, written by Charles Montgomery. Well, it's his consulting outfit that we partnered with and approached a competition for a project called Shore to Core in West Palm Beach, Florida. And the project was about, how do we not only connect people in the core of the city to the waterfront, but make sure that when we're doing public space interventions or making changes, that we're able to understand the place attachment or the happiness element, a sociability element of these changes, not just the physical, hey, we have more people here, but how are people feeling? How are they reacting? How does their heart rate change? What are the physical signs, person to person, that we can measure before and after? And so we ran an experiment where we had a control group, and we took them along a walk on the waterfront, recorded some of their emotions and their feelings, and we had little meters on, and then we did the next morning we did an intervention where we completely changed the waterfront. It's a very nice waterfront promenade, but there really isn't anything to do there. There isn't a lot of landscape necessarily. There isn't a lot of places to sit. So we added some of these basic elements and what we call these fascination frames, which showed historical images in these actual large picture frames of what the waterfront used to look like historically. And we put all these things together very, very quickly for low cost, and then we ran the same group of people back through it. And we learned that the fascination with space and their level of comfort and their trust in their fellow citizens and their happiness changed because of the intervention. So it's a fascinating experiment, and one that we had never done before, quite frankly, because we don't really have a ton of that expertise in-house, but Happy City does. And we worked with the University of Virginia and an organization called Space Syntax to do all that evaluation. So it really was an academic study on the impact of a one-day intervention and what that promises in the longer term if some of these elements were to be made permanent. And that was the whole point.
What a fascinating idea. And I think that one of the things that we've learned is that these physical spaces matter for all of these different things. And that when you invest in physical space, it has a psychological impact no matter what that, even if we haven't fully understood what that is up to now, it's certainly there to some degree.
That's right.
You've, I think, at some point seen your work kind of straddle the line between government and non-governmental actors. And I wonder what you could say about where you think the role of government comes into this and where you think the role of a potentially more disruptive force from outside the government plays in.
Yeah, I mean, I am one who thinks that both are absolutely critical. You need advocates and agitators and visionaries and thinkers to push government, and then you need those same kinds of people within the inside of government who are constrained by process and bureaucracy and legitimacy, liability, those kinds of things. Like I love the interplay between those two. And where I think a lot of cities are missing out is that they don't see that they have a role to help catalyze the other. Because when you, as a city agent, are able to work with the talent that's latent in your city and unleash that energy and that demand, that civic will that you find in small communities up to very large cities, then you're missing the potential transformation of your community and getting people engaged in that in an authentic way. So when somebody goes out and does something that's, say, technically illegal, like paints a crosswalk where there wasn't one, or puts out orange cones in the middle of the night, or plungers, for example, to create a protected bike lane, the city can look at that in two ways. They can say, well, that was illegal. They didn't have our permission. That was dangerous. What if someone got into a car crash, and take that line of thinking and try to shut that activity down? Or they can look at that and say, hey, that was actually really bold. We understand that you feel strongly about this. We know a lot of people in our community feel strongly about this. How can we work together to create a process and a way for us to get this change to happen quicker and meet the needs of our citizens faster? Because planning certainly isn't doing it in the short term. So where we've seen communities like Seattle or Hamilton, Ontario, New York, Burlington, Vermont, many others, Fayetteville, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, we've seen these communities look at this and say, there's a huge opportunity here for us to work with citizens who are passionate, who can help us get all the things that we want to get done but don't have the capacity to do. And it's in a city's best interest, or it's a city's role, I think, to look at themselves as the ones who can create equity across the whole city, in the sense that if a project or an intervention or something happens from advocates or from a community group in one location or one neighborhood, and oftentimes these kinds of projects do happen in wealthier neighborhoods, then it's the city's role to be able to create a replicable model that makes that on offer and gives the resources and the technical tools to maybe less resource communities that make sure that they can have the same benefit. And again, that's where we've seen a huge need, and that's what we've been doing a lot of work with our client cities, is developing processes and tools that enable any kind of neighborhood to be able to do this work legally, with city support, with backing, with a clear process, and a way to engage in this change. Because we found that, regardless of socioeconomic status, people get the idea of a more, livable, prosperous neighborhood. People understand the ideas of access. People ask for these things. And this is one opportunity or one way that cities can actually start to engage with that and get results on the ground.
I'm intrigued. We mentioned, or you talked a little bit about equity becoming more important in this mindset earlier on, and here I think that comes out again in terms of helping under-resourced communities take on some of these issues. Have you seen in your work personally that idea of equity has become more important?
I think it's central to increasingly central to the field, and the challenge is, like with any buzzword or any shift in thinking in the field, how you do something that remains not just talk and remains actually impactful. And that's where the challenge is for, I think, cities around the country, and for practitioners like myself, is making sure that you're not just speaking about equity, but you're actually trying to deliver that on the ground and figure out what that looks like. And, in some communities, what you think as being a good and needed project is not what they might think. So it comes down to, again, to just engagement process and outreach and opportunities for people to engage in that dialogue. And that's going to be very different in one community versus the next, or one neighborhood versus the next. So you can't just take a one-size-fits-all approach to how you do that outreach and engagement and say, well, we reached out to every neighborhood in our city and that's equity. That's really not it. And what I'm fascinated by is cities like Seattle have actually created, through the Department of Transportation, a whole office dedicated to equity and to that outreach. And they're creating the kinds of outreach programs and trainings and things like that are providing jobs and resources for communities who need them, while helping them deliver better projects as an agency that thinks about transportation and public space. That, to me, is one of the leading cities that's out there doing this work. And there needs to be a lot more of that thinking in city agencies and, within RFPs, and the way that cities think about projects and let them out to the consultants or get advocates engaged. The city has a really strong leading role to play, in that you're only going to get consultants talking and working this way if they're asked to do it in most cases, right? And so being able to pick the best of the firms and the advocacy groups that are out there to engage in that work is something that a city can do that's very, really impactful. But I also want to underscore that in terms of the equity conversation, I feel like we're kind of possibly in the third round or second or third round of this idea. There's something called advocacy planning that was central to the mid to late 60s in the planning field. And there was a number of papers and books and practitioners who really kickstarted this whole idea of public engagement. And you have to think about planning before the late 1960s. There really was no public outreach or engagement like we see it today. I mean, if you compare it today with 1965, or say 2017 or 1967, you wouldn't recognize the planning field. A planner then wouldn't recognize all the things that planners get asked to do and do as on the day-to-day in terms of their outreach and engagement. There was no charrette. There really was no public workshop, But the way things have gone now is we're kind of in this revitalization cycle of cities, where I think in the 60s is about, bad things were happening to cities in the sense that people were tearing down neighborhoods, building expressways, further separating people who are leaving cities in droves. That created a whole set of problems. The set of problems we face today, we're actually tearing down those highways and we're reknitting our communities, and people want to live in cities again, so they're really desirable. It's creating a completely different set of challenges. And so in terms of what equity means, it's different now. And I think there's a generation of planners and designers, architects who are trying to figure that out again and kind of build on what was done in the last 30 or 40 years and anchor that in a different type of practice that responds to today and hopefully to tomorrow's concerns as it relates to public engagement.
But I think there's a fascinating question there in terms of at least for me, I wonder how long the city boom lasts. I guess in some ways, because I think we've seen these things cycle now, and this past cycle upwards for cities has been very rapid, as you mentioned, and has taken a lot of folks by surprise. And I wonder, how do we create systems that adapt so that when that either levels out or it starts going back downhill, that we still have institutions and systems that react appropriately to that.
Yeah, I think that's where a huge challenge is, because contrary to 30-year comprehensive plans and economic projections and everything else, we don't know the future. And you can extrapolate and make guesses that are educated, but I think if you talk to somebody in the neighborhood where I worked in 2005, let's say, or 2000, and you fast forward and said, give them a glimpse of what it looks like today, they might not recognize it, right? They might be shocked by that. And that's only a period of 10 years. So change does happen rapidly, and trends come and go, and, economies are in cycles, and boom and bust are in cycles. But what I do think is different about cities today is I think people are fundamentally rediscovering the joy of proximity. And so whether that is you can live 3 blocks from your main street in a town of 5,000 people, or that means, you live in the heart of, Chicago or New York City, people understand the value of proximity in a way that was not the case for many, many years. And people are, I think, tired of the kind of infrastructure that defines post-war suburban sprawl. And so while we're going to continue to have lots of suburbs, I think people want a different kind of suburb. They want opportunities to have transportation options, and they want to be able to walk, and they want to be able to access a mixture of uses and things that in the vast majority of suburbs don't exist. So we might not see the same rate of change in the core CBDs and inner neighborhoods in a New York or Chicago or a Louisville or even a Roanoke at the same rate. We might, but we might not. But I don't think that's going to fundamentally change that people who are living a more drivable suburban lifestyle wouldn't also like to have some more urbanity and walkability in their neighborhoods or close by. And so that shift is definitely, I think, fundamental. And a lot of my colleagues, look at the last 60 or 70 years of suburban sprawl and say, look, that's actually an experiment. No one in human history has ever arranged themselves on the landscape in that manner. And we've seen all the ways that falls down economically, from a public health perspective, socially. And so I think we will have those places. They're not going to be abandoned tomorrow or in 10, 30 years, but those areas have to figure out how they transform themselves into places that are more desirable for the future, which I think is going to swing back and is swinging back towards the kind of track that we've been on with communities and building villages and towns and cities for thousands and thousands of years. And I think that's where we're at now, is trying to figure out how suburbs and towns can figure that out, which is challenging politically. It's very challenging financially. The cost of changing that infrastructure is absolutely enormous. So it's going to happen in fits and starts.
Well, now, this is so fascinating. I hate to kind of cut it short, but as we get kind of close to the end, I wonder if you could share something that you've learned along the way. I mean, it's been, 7 years now since you started writing about tactical urbanism, or even longer than that?
Let's see, it's been about 6 years since we've been writing about it. So, I think, a couple of things we've learned a ton, honestly. It's hard to pack that into one response, but I would say the value of sharing our ideas and sharing our observations was critical from day one for us as a company and as an organization, and as a way to build a movement, was making that information free and open to anybody. And that was a very intentional move on our part back in 2011. And I never could have imagined that it would have the uptake that it did with that very first guide and the subsequent guide in 2012. Those two really impacted a lot of people's thinking and reached a lot of people precisely because they were free. And, we've written a full-length book, and And Island Press might shudder to think about this response of mine, but they're a great publisher and they've sold a good, healthy number of books. And we're really pleased and proud of that effort. And it was really important for us to put everything into a volume like that. But just the $15 to $20 price tag is a barrier. And the number of people who have accessed this idea through tools like Twitter and through us putting all these publications online for free through our website and through issue.com and places like that has meant that if we had just written a book, we would have missed out on literally hundreds of thousands of people around the globe taking this idea and running with it. And so to me, the real lesson there is don't be shy in sharing ideas and resources and get them out there. And if you can do that and have confidence in the strength of the idea, you never know where it's going to go. And I think we feel very lucky that people have gotten excited by this idea because we're excited by it. We continue to be excited by it. And we keep learning all the new ways that other people take this concept and apply it in their own communities globally is really, really fascinating. And again, we get better at practicing it through how others figure out new ways of practicing. And that's kind of the joy of being engaged in the work.
I think that's such a powerful message for all of us, that we often want to live in a world of scarcity, but by living in a world of sharing, that you get so much farther towards the end. That's something I certainly appreciate about your guys' work. So, and I wonder, if kind of to wrap us up here, if you could share a story that you think kind of encapsulates how you think communities should work, or a community that's working well.
Wow, that's a hard one to answer, honestly. Well, the one that's top of mind is a body of work that we're very proud of, which is still ongoing in Burlington, Vermont. And the quick story, and if anyone who's listening has seen me present in the last probably 18 months, you've probably heard me speak about this, but at risk of boring any of your audience members, I will share that we were hired with another firm up in Burlington, Vermont, a firm called DuBois & King, who does a lot of engineering and planning work, to write the city's first bicycle and pedestrian master plan. And when we started this process in 2015, we were really excited. Burlington's a very progressive community, town of 40,000 people, college town, lots of passion, lots of cyclists and lots of walkers. In fact, when we arrived, they already had about 26%, actually 30% of their community already walking, biking, or taking the bus to work. So they got that far without even having a plan or a framework for where or how they would do investment in that kind of infrastructure. But in any event, so we got engaged there and quickly learned from a community member that there was a lot of passion to demonstrate the value of protected bike lanes. And this citizen proposed doing a one-day pop-up to help her kids get to and from school safely. And the city thought that was a great idea. It was obviously consistent in the direction that we were just about to go in with the master planning process. But they had no way to say yes to the community member. They had no policy, no program, no way to say, yes, this is how we deal with liability. This is how you as a volunteer can work in the street and build out this bikeway. So unfortunately, they had to say no. And we quickly heard about that and said, whoa, that's a great idea. That's a phenomenal to have someone in your community already proposing to do something like this, because that's how we want to do engagement with you anyway. And very quickly we were able to work with the city, and to their huge credit, we pulled together the advocates, we pulled together the fire chief and police and parks department and the planners and public works, and said, hey, let's figure this out. Let's see if we can't develop a policy and develop guidance as part of our plan here that would allow citizens to do their own 1 to 7 day long demonstration projects. And so while we started the planning process, we also started writing this policy. And we took about 6 to 8 weeks to get that draft done. This was all in the summer of 2015. And then we got the draft done, and we said, hey, it's kind of coalesces with our schedule to do a lot of public outreach. And there are 2 big events coming up. Why don't we do demonstration projects with community members alongside the Department of Public Works, and let's all of us go out there and change the way the streets work, directly leading to or within these 2 big events. There's Art Walk and an Open Streets event. And so we, long story short, created, curb extensions and public spaces, and we did protected bikeways, and we did a lot of evaluation and surveying and measurement. But really, it was a way to test out our own policy to see where the gaps would be for community members if, when street plans is gone, or a planning firm is no longer there. How does a community member who may not be educated work with the city? What does the process look like? What are the pain points? And how do we ferret those out through our own testing with the community of the policy? And we learned a lot from that, and we were able to refine that policy, do a lot of great engagement, get a master plan that was just adopted this spring, as well as getting the policy in the hands of the community where they can now do demonstration projects, which helps the city and helps the community test out these new ideas. And so they were able to take that and then roll that into what they now have the pilot process. So they have a process in the city where they can test out projects for up to a year. And then what we're currently working on with them now is what we're calling quick build, which is taking the priority projects on the out of the master plan and doing quick build projects, which are interim design materials that will last from 1 year to 5 years. And so in the plan, the budget will increase down the line in year, I think, 4 and 5. But in the interim, their budget's going to be about the same. So we wanted to take that budget and try out a bunch of different new designs out of the master plan, have those on the ground for a couple of years, and then inform the long-term capital budget once the increase occurs. And so at this point, really long story short, they have a demonstration project and policy, demonstration project policy for advocates and community members that goes from 1 to 7 days. They have a pilot project process, which goes from 30 days to a year, that's city sanctioned and city led. They have now a quick build program that we're developing with them and rolling out on these priority projects from year 1 to 5. And then a master plan that kind of gives them a framework for the next 10 years. So all 4 of those phases are now embedded in the community to make change. And we call that the kind of a 21st century project delivery process that was not in place as recently as several months ago. So it's exciting, and we think that Burlington is a model for any community to be able to create those steps along the way to test before you invest and engage people along the way and make sure that when you do invest in the long term, you've got a much better understanding about what's going to work and what won't.
What a fascinating story to wind up on, especially as you can see that, your whole message and theme of this short-term change impacting and creating, transformative change down the road. You guys have been able to do that in this community. That's just such a powerful story. For those of you all listening, if you'd like to hear Mike's talk from CityWorks Expo a few years ago, you can check it out on our website, cityworksexpo.com. But again, thank you so much for taking the time today, Mike.
Great. Thank you. Good to chat with you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.